The mention of Arizona in the 19th century usually brings up images of Wyatt Earp shooting it out with bandits in Tombstone. However, the conflict in Tombstone pales in comparison to the war that ripped across Arizona and New Mexico 2 decades earlier. Before the Arizona that we know, there was a version of Arizona that stretched from the border with California all the way to Texas. This is a story of the people who founded this territory in the harsh desert, why they joined the rebellion against the United States, and how most of them lost their dream. This is the story of the Confederate Territory of Arizona. Most of the modern Southwest, from Salt Lake City to San Diego, was conquered by the United States in 1847 and 48 in the Mexican-American War. But there was another chunk of land that wasn't added to the New Mexico Territory until the 1853 Gadsden Purchase. This added the southern 25% of modern-day Arizona, plus the small chunk of southwestern New Mexico that includes present-day Deming. Almost immediately in 1853, Anglo-Americans from Texas and other nearby states moved to settle in the new territory. It was a harsh, arid desert, much like the West Texas frontier, but, like much of existing New Mexico, was far more picturesque and beautiful. While Santa Fe and Albuquerque were the economic centers of the large New Mexico territory, the residents and settlers 300 miles to the south managed to hold their own. Ranching was a major occupation for the Mesilla Valley, while the towns that grew in the nearby Gadsden Purchase depended on mining, especially gold and silver. The number one concern for southern New Mexico, even more than scratching a living out of the desert, was safety from Apache raids. The mighty warrior nation had been fighting on and off with Spanish and later Mexican colonists in the area for over 250 years. Whether they knew it or not, incoming Anglo-American settlers were invaders on Apache land, and their squatting, which they justified by calling manifest destiny, effectively signed them up for the risk of violent reprisal from the traditional stewards of those lands. As soon as Americans started moving into the Gadsden lands, or settling in nearby Mesilla along the way from Texas, there was a movement to organize a new territory. Author J. Ross Brown described the Tucson of the late 1850s and early 60s as a city of mud boxes, dingy and dilapidated, cracked and baked into a composite of dust and filth, littered about with broken corrals, sheds, bake ovens, carcasses of dead animals, and broken pottery. The best view of Tucson is the rear view on the road to Fort Yuma. Despite many travelers sharing this negative opinion of the area, people still somehow manage to eke out a living in this collection of mud boxes and in the surrounding rock hills in the Arizona region's harsh desert. The population and cultural center in the southeast of the territory was the city of Mesilla. There were 6,200 Anglo-Americans and Mexicans spread around Doña Ana County, of which Mesilla was the county seat. Doña Ana County did not count Native Americans in its census, due to New Mexico's historic hostility to Native Americans, so we can only guess their number in or around the Mesilla Valley. In the New Mexico Historical Review, Charles Walker gives us a glimpse of what daily life looked like in Mesilla. He writes, "From Texas and Mexico came merchants driving carts and wagons of produce, even at the expense of a tax on each wagon, from 50 cents to $1. Fruit, vegetables, and other produce were sold on the plazas either in booths or open to the sky. Meat vendors hawked their products to the populace, sometimes even butchering the animals before the eyes of prospective purchasers who had come to the market from up and down the valley. Wood sellers drove carts, wagons, or burros heavily loaded, or if they were willing to pay the tax, deposited their wood on the plaza, paid the city 25 cents, and disposed of their wares. Women might be seen kneeling over irrigation ditches, washing out clothing and soiled articles. For amusement, there were balls, fandangos, theatrical productions, and billiards. In the midst of all the hubbub in the days prior to the war, the stage of the Butterfield Overland Mail Company would swerve into the plaza with a cracking of whips to deposit passengers, luggage, or mail. Enough people had moved to southern New Mexico that by 1857 there was a convention where dozens of leading locals signed a petition to the federal government to organize a territory in what was then known as the Arizona region. They had another convention in 1859 where they decided they really wanted a territorial government and more federal army protection and political representation in Washington for the proposed Arizona Territory. One of the leading activists for territorial organization was Dr. Lewis Owings. Owings was a 40-year-old Tennessean frontier doctor who had lived as a pioneer in Arkansas and Texas, and who'd founded the Texas town of Helena before moving to the New Mexico Territory. He had acquired the nickname Peg Leg in his youth because one leg was shorter than the other, causing him to walk with a limp. His hobby as an adult was founding or co-founding frontier towns and then trying to get the upper hand on developing businesses in those growing towns. Hence, to keep growing the settlements in southern New Mexico, Owings joined the movement agitating for a new territory in the South. The territorial government in Santa Fe recognized that the residents in the new southwestern lands needed public services and representation, so they created Arizona County in January of 1860, with offices including sheriff and district judge, and near-future representation in the territorial legislature. This county business didn't work for the folks of the Arizona movement. No longer willing to wait for permission from faraway politicians who obviously didn't care about them, 31 leading citizens from the areas of Mesilla and Tucson, including Anglo-American and Mexican-American merchants, and even a few New Mexico public officials from those areas, held a territorial convention in the town of Tucson from April 2nd to 5th. The delegates elected Dr. Lewis Owings as the provisional territorial governor, and then Owings appointed fellow Mesilla businessman Ignacio Orrantia, a leader in Arizona's homegrown Mexican community, as lieutenant governor. At the time, Orrantia represented Doña Ana County in the New Mexico Legislative Assembly, thus giving equal parts legitimacy and controversy to the renegade new territory. At the Territorial Convention, Orrantia was also appointed to the Constitutional Drafting Committee. By the fourth day of the convention, April 5th, the Gadsden Purchase settlers and the Mesilla Valley men had organized a provisional government for the territory of Arizona, with the desire for incorporation into the United States. Some of the people in the new territorial government had fascinating and truly colorful backstories. Treasurer Mark Aldrich, originally from Illinois, was one of the 5 defendants tried and acquitted for the murder of Joseph Smith, founder of the Latter-day Saints faith. Aldrich later moved south and became the first mayor of Tucson after the Gadsden Purchase, before later joining the Arizona Territorial Movement. The Provisional Chief Justice, Granville Orry, was one of a few Anglo-Americans to survive a failed filibuster expedition to the Mexican state of Sonora in 1857. He was serving as a New Mexico district judge for Doña Ana County in 1860 when he was appointed Chief Justice for the new breakaway territory. He later briefly served as Confederate Arizona's congressional delegate during the Civil War, and is the only person to have represented the Arizona Territory in both the U.S. and Confederate Congresses. The Territorial Marshal, Samuel Bean, had served 3 terms as sheriff of Doña Ana County, and was a deputy U.S. Marshal before April 1860. District Judge Edward McGowan was formerly a judge in San Francisco. McGowan was tried and acquitted for accessory to murder in 1856, but he left California to escape vigilantes who wanted him dead. He later narrowly escaped prosecution in British Columbia for almost starting both an Indian War and an armed rebellion against the provincial government at the same time. After that, he decided to try his luck in a desert far off to the south. Thomas Maston was a 21-year-old lawyer when appointed a district attorney for Arizona, and would be the only member of the provisional government who died in the Civil War. Adjutant General Palatine Robinson was infamous for having killed R.A. Johnson, a veteran of William Walker's Nicaragua expedition. Although to his credit it was in self-defense, since Johnson showed up uninvited to Robinson's house with a gun. Robinson was also accused of kidnapping and selling a local Mexican girl, Ramona Ortega, although this was never proven. Every public official in the provisional government was sworn to uphold the laws of the Constitution of the United States. Interestingly enough, 10 of the 31 delegates were leaders in the local Mexican community, which had lived in the region before the border crossed them with the Gadsden Purchase. Some of the Mexican delegates at the convention needed an interpreter, so Convention Secretary James Lewis, who was bilingual, interpreted for them. Their territorial Magna Carta required citizens to be white, but Hispanics were counted as white, although Native American residents were specifically excluded from citizenship, and African slavery, already legal in the New Mexico Territory, was grandfathered in. The first printing of the Territorial Constitution and proceedings of the convention was 250 copies in English and 150 copies in Spanish, and it was the first book ever printed in Arizona. The Spanish translation of the Constitution was provided by Tucson resident Agustin Ainsa, whose family had some political baggage. Ainsa was a Mexican born in Sonora, but who frequently traveled north of the border after the Mexican War to work and do business. Like many families in the borderlands, his family had intermarried with Anglo-Americans. Ainsa's brother-in-law, former California State Senator Henry Crabb, died leading a company of filibusters on an expedition to Mexico during the Reform War in 1857. This resulted in Ainsa living in the United States in exile, the Gadsden Purchase lands being the closest that he would ever be able to get to his home state of Sonora. He intimately knew the risks of political intrigue when he volunteered to translate the unrecognized territory's founding documents. Also, one additional detail worth mentioning is that Ainsa had a large ring-shaped meteorite on his ranch near Tucson, which was really his wife's ranch near Tucson, but this business of the meteorite will come up again later. After appointing the rest of his cabinet and filling the territorial offices at the convention, Owings' first act as governor was to authorize the adjutant general to raise 2 companies of militia. He eventually raised 3, by the way, which were raised from the Pinos Altos mining camps, the town of Tucson, and the city of Mesilla. The Territorial Militia spent much of the year 1860 at war with the Mimbreño Apache Band, which the Arizonans won, although that victory was only against one band and didn't account for the other autonomous bands of Apache. Dr. Owings was deeply respected by all who identified with the Arizonan cause, which was most of the Anglo population in southern New Mexico's breakaway counties. In the beginning of this territorial movement, even many Mexican Arizonans felt the frustration with faraway Santa Fe and thought that something good could come out of a more localized governing body. On October 25, 1860, the Mesilla Times reported on Owings and the First Lady meeting and greeting constituents at the Pinos Altos mines. Last Thursday, Governor Owings and Lady left here on Catlett's Express to pay a visit to the mines, when within about 3 miles of the mining camp, we were to our astonishment met by a courier, tastefully dressed in blue pants, striped elaborately with yellow, Kossuth hat with plumes and cockades, mounted on a fine charger, and armed with the inseparable 6-shooter. Shortly afterwards, after entering a romantic little glen, happily selected, we discovered the gallant Colonel Sterton, with 2 companies of mounted men, one dressed in the uniform of our courier, and the other in blue with yellow trimmings, armed with lances, and bearing a very pretty banner, in which the governor's favorite colors, the red, white, and blue, were neatly blended, making a decidedly brilliant appearance. At a sign, we drew up and, after introducing the officers of his staff, the colonel presented his troops to the governor. Then, a portion of the cavalry wheeling into line in our rear, the procession moved gloriously onto town. Neither Santa Fe nor Washington, D.C. had recognized the breakaway territory, but the Arizonans had managed to set up a semi-functional, albeit understaffed government, and had successfully mobilized that governing body and the local population to win a small war. When states started seceding a few months later, in late 1860 and early 1861, the Federal Army began vacating frontier forts to recall the regular troops back east. This left the Arizonans even more exposed to Apache attacks, and caused a great deal of alienation against the federal government in those lands. For a better idea of the dangers faced by these pioneers, the 1860 New Mexico census lists the causes of death for Arizona County. The top killer was illness, claiming over 70 lives, with the top offenders being fever, dysentery, and cholera. The second leading cause of death was Apache raiders, taking 40 lives, while criminal homicide was a distant third with a mere 10 murders. Losing the meager protection of federal army patrols increased the physical danger for Arizonans, but losing the Butterfield Overland Stagecoach in March 1861 added a major economic and communicational burden for the settlers. Since the Anglo-American settlers were predominantly Southern-born, and because Washington had left them to their fate during the secession crisis, the unrecognized territory naturally leaned towards the new Southern Confederacy. On March 16, 1861, still weeks before the Battle of Fort Sumter, leading citizens of the Arizona Territory, including Governor Owings and several other officials from the provisional government, held a convention in Mesilla where they voted to secede from the Union and petition the Confederate States for annexation. Doña Ana County Judge Thomas Bull remained strictly neutral during the secession crisis. He didn't recognize Arizona's separation from New Mexico or the United States, but he didn't confront the rebel government in Mesilla either. Beginning in April 1861, though, Bull decreed that all taxes and license fees collected for the first 6 months of that year be returned to the taxpayers. This way, the money wouldn't go to Santa Fe or to the rebel government in Mesilla. On April 9th, Judge Bull sent a letter to the citizens who happened to be the governor and lieutenant governor of Arizona, demanding that they return 40 muskets that were county property. These, of course, were the weapons issued to the Arizona Rangers, that being the name of the Territorial Militia. On June 6, 1861, Governor Owings and 3 other lobbyists from the Provisional Government of Arizona wrote a letter to the former U.S. General E.L. Covey, a known rebel, saying, "Dear Sir, you will confer on the citizens of this territory by representing to the department at Montgomery our exposed condition with which you are perfectly familiar. We desire above all things a territorial organization by the Confederate States of America, then subjugation of all the Indian tribes, and the administration of law and justice. Should the Confederate Congress not deem it prudent to give us these, please ask that means be sent to this territory to arm and equip one volunteer regiment to be kept in active service against the marauding savages. This would ensure us peace with the Indians and would strengthen and perpetuate that sympathy with the South which is now unanimous." In July, Confederate Colonel Rip Ford of the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles occupied the east banks of the Rio Grande to prevent the Federals in New Mexico from invading Texas. Ford's commander, General Earl Van Dorn, sent Ford's second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel John R. Baylor, into New Mexico with just under 300 mounted riflemen to establish a buffer zone between the Federal garrison at Fort Fillmore and the Confederates at Fort Bliss, Texas. And so, Baylor and his men came riding one day into Mesilla. That last week of July 1861 must have been the climax of Dr. Owings' entire career. His provisional government was semi-functional and in its second year of operation. Then, Lieutenant Colonel Baylor showed up out of nowhere with a battalion of Confederate soldiers to help fight off Apache raiders. Then the rebels scored a terrific victory against the retreating Federal garrison from Fort Fillmore. This double victory cleared all Federal troops out of the unrecognized pro-Confederate territory and also vaporized any chance of Arizona officials being arrested for seceding from the Union. After this unexpected, stunning, bloodless victory, the Mesilla Times printed the headline, "Arizona is free at last." This euphoric moment for the rebellion was the closest the 1860 provisional government would get to independence or Confederate organization, and the closest that pro-Confederate civilians in Arizona would come to feeling like free citizens. A week later, on August 1st, a confident Colonel Baylor proclaimed the Confederate Territory of Arizona, with himself as military governor. And the following day, he declared martial law and appointed a new cabinet to carry out his absolute authority. Arizona's formal organization as a territory was now practically guaranteed thanks to the Confederate Army, but at the cost of the civilian government elected by the Territorial Conventions of 1860 and 1861. For the governor and lieutenant governor of the Provisional Government of Arizona, the dream was stolen by a military dictator. This concludes part 1. In the next part, we'll look at the high points and the low points of the Arizona Territory under the Confederate States. Thank you for watching the Civil War Wild West Edition.